I'm very pleased to participate in this program and to say a few words about the sociology of prejudice and about discrimination. As we look back on Washington, there's no question of the fact that both of these phenomena, both segregation and...
In the mic.
Can you hear me now?
Okay. Our late panelist, Dr. Martin.
I've been waiting around at the other end of the building.
One,
so
two.
Stay there until you call for me.
I was about to say that both segregation and prejudice have had a clear manifestation in the experience of the Washington community. If one traces out the history of blacks in the city of Washington, it's clear to all of us that over a long period of the past history, blacks have experienced both prejudice and discrimination. The phenomenon of discrimination, however, I believe is more important than the phenomenon of prejudice. As sociologists, we know that people can live with their prejudices, but the results of discrimination are much sharper and more telling. If we look at the period from 1860 onward, we find that blacks have certainly been influenced by discrimination in the nation's capital. And what is significant is that while we developed a full black community with very prominent figures, and it would appear that the black community was not affected, it is nonetheless the case that behind what Constance Green called the secret city, blacks have been greatly affected. Over the past day or so, we've had we have had testimony that behind the walls of segregation we've developed a viable and influential black community, producing such people as you had to testify to you on yesterday. But that is not the whole story. Any accounting of the experiences of Negroes in Washington will actually give an account of what happened to blacks in terms of not being able to reach their full potential. When I came to Washington in 1941, this marks the 40th year of my experience in Washington, we could have lunch or breakfast or eat with our friends, white friends, in only two places in this community, one at the YWCA and the other at the Savin restaurant at the Union Station. And when one looks at the community itself, what we call the ghetto, blacks had not penetrated much farther than Spring Road up in the northwest. And in only small points in the northwest, they had a community which was sort of heavily bounded from the central business district up to about Howard University and the environs as we moved north, and perhaps to 13th Street, 14th Street as we moved west. I won't try to define that because time does not permit of it. The truth of the matter is that this was the Negro community which had a very viable stem, which was U Street, along which developed small Negro businesses, a bank, insurance companies, etc. But when one thinks of what the experience of blacks, when I came here there was something like 28% of the total population black. It is today, as you know, more than 70% black. But this does not tell the real story. We can measure it in terms of how many more blacks paid what for housing than whites did. But the real telling effect of all of this is the fact that it never released the full potential. Segregation did not permit a full release of the potential of the black community, whether they went to Dunbar, whether they went to Armstrong, whether they went to other schools. Nonetheless, there were thousands of blacks in this community with abilities almost unmeasured that could not receive full nourishment and nurture for the kinds of experiences and the kinds of abilities which blacks were willing to demonstrate. And so I say that whatever else we say in these few days about the past and about blacks in Washington, it nonetheless seems to me we ought to take account of the fact that in the shadow of the nation's capital, many of the full potentials of blacks could not be released in such a community. I'll give you just one or two examples of the kind of things that have struck me, mainly because these become the subject matter of the panel for the rest of the afternoon. When I came to Washington, and for a long time thereafter, certainly from 1950 on, and I know something about this because I've studied it, black lawyers in this community were almost solo practitioners. And while they were very good lawyers, very excellent lawyers, they didn't have the opportunity to actually demonstrate that in the way that they should have. The truth of the matter is that we had legal giants like Charlie Houston and others, but they were fighting the system in order to gain for blacks, and for black attorneys more particularly, the kinds of experiences which they observed. And when I looked at 72 black lawyers in 1950, almost every one of them was a solo practitioner. Almost every one of those lawyers were quartered somewhere either in their homes or along U Street. Almost every one of those lawyers had a very restricted practice in terms of the kinds of cases that they handled. Here were men of demonstrated ability. There was not, I think there was one black who was connected with the court system, and that was about it. And one can get a measure of the change which has occurred since that time when one observes that today about 1/4 of the judges in the Superior Court are black men. The truth of the matter is the chief judge is black. One looks at the Court of Appeals for the district, one sees that, I can't remember, this figure keeps changing so much, 4 or 5 of the justices there are black, and that's headed by a black chief judge. When one looks at the federal courts, the presence of the blacks is well known, with the chief judge of the U.S. District Court, a black man, and of course on the appellate court, we have blacks, and we have a black on the U.S. Supreme Court. Now this was unheard of in 1950 when I looked at this. With regard to physicians, we had more than 200 black physicians in this community at the same time, but almost all of those men were in private practice. Of course, we didn't have the organization of medicine such as we have today with HMOs and others. But of the 92 black men in America who were specialists of specialty boards, 26 of them were here, and most of them were connected with Howard University. And these men couldn't all practice their specialties. They had to engage in kind of general practice along with their specialties. But since that time, the numbers increased. It increased nationwide to something like 366 by 1966. And today, blacks are taking their places in medicine much the same as others. It was the longest time before blacks could join the county medical associations of the AMA. It was the longest time before they could practice in the Washington Hospital Center, what is now the Hospital Center. They were almost effectively excluded from the profession. And I don't have much time, but I just want to say now we've come to the point where the year before last, a black man, a distinguished orthopedic surgeon, was president of the District Medical Society, and that gives some measure of how far we have come. I want to say that we can take these indices, and I could stay here for another 2 hours and talk about housing and other areas, but I want to say one thing that one can't really get a handle on and can't fully measure. It is the sense of self and the sense of self-esteem and self-respect that segregation always compromises. And no matter how much we talk about the black Washington family and the black Washington school and what supports children who went to those schools received, and certainly these were antidotes to the kinds of community practices which existed, no one can fully measure the toll which segregation in any community takes. That is to say, it makes its impact sometimes in very subtle ways, and at times not so subtle. But nonetheless, to get a full view of the kinds of potential which America offers its people can never exist under a system of segregation and discrimination. I said earlier that it occurs to me that of the two forces, prejudice and discrimination, discrimination is by far the greater evil. The truth of the matter is that people can live with their prejudices, and though prejudice may in fact dictate the kind of community practices, nonetheless, when the laws apply and when people are given their constitutional rights, those who are prejudiced can live with their prejudices. The important thing is that people have a full opportunity to express themselves and to release the kinds of talents that they have. And Washington for a long time would not permit this, and the salvation for many of the blacks in Washington, people who lived there, is that they brought to it something beyond what many people could bring to it. They brought to a sense of family, they brought to it tradition, they brought to it good teachers in segregated schools and so on. But I think it's to the glory of those people that we say that they did their work well. But the community must be condemned in a very sharp way for having allowed for so long a system to exist which didn't give full expression to the potentials of black people. While we have, I don't want to call names, but great people who came out of the system, we can't tell how many other great ones would have come out of it had the system been different. I think my time is gone, and I'm sorry I can't say all the things I want to say. And I'm put now in a different kind of role. I'm asked to moderate, at least for some time, the rest of the proceedings. As you observed from your program, that the general subject matter is civil rights and segregation in the professions. And we have a panel made up of 6 people, one of whom may not be able to get here. But beginning now, we want to talk a little bit about, not a little bit, but as fully as we can, we want to talk about law, politics, economics, and journalism. And we have with us, as our first speaker on this subject, Mr. Mal J. Good of New Jersey, who will now speak to us.
Thank you very much. Let me say at the outset, I'm more than pleased to be a part of this discussion. It comes real late in our lives and in the history of this country. My participation has to do with journalism, and for whatever it may mean, I say it with some degree of immodesty that I've been in all ends of the publication spectrum, from 14 years with the Pittsburgh Courier when it was the largest black newspaper in the country, to the printed media, the white printed media, local radio stations, to the network at ABC, and now I serve as a consultant for the National Black Radio Network. And certainly from the standpoint of the importance of the media, segregation is still almost as rampant as it ever was. There's nothing more than a participation on a token basis for us. A little girl asked me in a press conference some years ago when I was at ABC, after I'd been there 8 years, what's it been like? And I tell you this story because I think it describes best what I want to say to you this afternoon, and maybe we can say more during the question and answer period. But I said to her, in the eight years I've been with ABC, there's never been a day that something didn't come up to either actually or psychologically remind me that I was still black. That still exists, as evidenced by what you see, and on a token basis now. I've traveled crisscross this country many times in the last 8 years since I retired from ABC. I've never seen 4 black anchor persons where there were 4 anchor persons. I've seen 2 on one occasion, 2 on 3 occasions, and once 3 on a weekend. That was because somebody couldn't get there. And much of my participation at the network level came on weekends and filling in for somebody in an emergency like the Cuban Missile Crisis when it got bad on a weekend in October 1962. They couldn't find anybody but me, so they had no choice. So I wasn't under some illusion that I was a great broadcaster under any circumstances. But I think it needs to be said that we need a strong black media in this country, as strong today as it ever was, more so than ever, because the white media and major networks, radio stations, any facet, they're not going to tell our story. When I say our story, I mean the black man's story. And what they do tell oftentimes is from a negative point of view. They have a great program on now that's handled by a longtime colleague of mine, Ted Koppel, and I'm going to write a letter to him. I've been holding off because I've been traveling, but I want to write Ted and get him to do something in depth some night on it, not just a smattering of it for a half hour and then forget it, don't come back to it anymore for 3 or 4 months. To those of you who live in Washington, I come with no apologies to you. I don't live in New York. I wouldn't live there gave me a free apartment in Midtown Manhattan because blacks there are like many blacks in Washington. You believe all the problems are solved. New Yorkers believe the problems are solved, yet they couldn't elect a black mayor with 550,000 available votes 2 years ago. I live over in a nest of blacks of the same caliber in Teaneck, New Jersey, who believe they've arrived. If 2 cars in the driveway, neither one paid for, and they have a game room in the basement, some wall-to-wall carpeting, so they don't even know prejudice when it does exist. Only last Tuesday, a week ago tomorrow, we had an opportunity to put 3 black women on the school board. We just barely got 1. So there's 1 on the school board out of 9 and 1 in the council out of 7. No freeholders out of 13, yet the population is 27% black. 14% of the blacks last Tuesday in the town I live in voted. 14%. To give you an idea of what we face and how backward we are on this, and I suspect it's almost as bad in the city of Washington in what I call D.C., the District of Confusion. I'm sure you've heard that before, but I don't come to be critical. I come objectively, and I'm pleased that this conference is being held, that it might be brought to the attention of those who live here how bad off we are from the standpoint of being some 11 or 12% of the total population. To give you an idea, and most of the people in my church yesterday when I mentioned it didn't even know it, but last Friday we're in Geneva when Mrs. Kirkpatrick, the new ambassador to the UN, who entertained the military figures from South Africa secretly 6 or 7 weeks ago, she went to Geneva to pledge $285 million toward the $590 million that they finally got in a 2-day conference for the relief of 5 million African refugees. And the statement she made was, we are pleased to come and be a part of this conference because 26 million of our citizens have roots in Africa and we're proud of them. You won't believe that, but you go back and, I didn't see it in any of the papers. I didn't hear it on television. I didn't hear it on radio anywhere. But that's what Jean Kirkpatrick said to the delegates of more than 100 countries who gathered in Geneva last Thursday and Friday to raise that $590 million. I cite that to let you know that if we had a strong and a fair media, many of these segregation practices which still exist in 1981 wouldn't exist at all. My hope is that we would take enough initiative on our own. When I say we, I mean blacks and decent thinking whites in this country would take it on ourselves, the initiative to push for equality of participation. It's all right, and I have no criticism of anybody else. I know that we can go in restaurants now, and I stay usually, when I come here, when I don't stay with my friends in Washington, I stay at the Hilton, and I stay at the Mayflower. So what? I go to the fine restaurants here. So what? I have money in my pocket. If I didn't have some money to pay $12, $15 for a dinner, I wouldn't be able to go in those places. So we need to do something about the discrimination so that millions of our brothers and sisters can someday go in these places too and will have the money. The same, it has to do with total participation. There are more than 15 or 18 regular anchor persons at the network level. We boast now of having one, and I rejoice every time I see him. Max Robinson, who served you so well here, and you miss him, I'm sure, in Washington, and Ed Bradley, a talented journalist, if there ever was one, a talented broadcaster. He may go on 60 Minutes in another month or so, but he's been restricted to the weekends. As far as the 250, 260 persons that do network broadcasting across the country, only about 22 of them happen to be black men and women, and rarely do you see them, and when sometimes you hear their voices, and they don't even put their faces on the screen. All that ought to be done away with after more than 30 years of the television medium being in existence. And so it is in the matter of sports. We can do something. I say this and I'm through. I think this conference ought to bring out the fact that we can do something besides stuff a ball in a basket, put a football under our arm and run in the end zone and dance like a monkey like that fool from the Houston Oilers, or we can do something. Or we can do something besides hit a home run, and we can do something besides dance and sing. And make no mistake about it, Willie Stargell and Moses Malone and Cal Murphy and Dr. J from the Sixers are personal friends of mine, and I love them almost like I love my own sons. And I rejoice in Billy Eckstein and Diane Carroll and all the others who participate and entertain us. But we can do something besides entertain, and we need to fight to participate in that at every level. And I hope something comes out of this conference that will bring that about. Thank you very much.
We'll go right ahead, and the next speaker will be Dr. Robert E. Martin.
Thank you, Frank. First of all, I'd like to apologize for coming in here tardy. I came into the other end of the building, and they had me to sign in, gave me this badge, and told me to have a seat in the library and wait until I was called. And I guess I'd be sitting there now if the hour hadn't gotten late, and I decided I'd better look for some other location. I want to say a little something about early experiences that were crucial in helping to determine my line of interest, my effort, like many black people, to try to find a place that would be rewarding in a world that placed many barriers before them. As you know, reading is of crucial importance in helping to provide a basis for developing knowledge, understanding, intellectual growth. And I think it was my interest in reading that helped to steer me in some of the main directions to determine where I'd be going in life. And I tried to figure out what it was that got me so interested in reading in order that I might help my own children and my students with whom I have been working for many years. And I've never been able to understand it. I recall that in the South, in the small towns where we lived, I never heard the word library, let alone know what one was. I used to buy battered, abandoned school books from white playmates in order to find something to read. And when I was living in Selma, North Carolina, during elementary school days, I had a practice, I don't know how it developed, but every Sunday after Sunday school, I would go down to the station, the railway station, and buy two newspapers. They were out-of-town newspapers. They didn't publish a newspaper in this small town. And I'd take those newspapers home and get me a pillow and get under the window, and I'd read them through before I would go out and play. I can remember one of those papers was the New York News. And one of the stories I always read, because it was there every week, was some famous murder. Well, at junior high school age, my mother moved to Washington, and for the first time I discovered the library. I used to haunt the library down at 7th and New York Avenue. I went through all of the books I could find there. I was particularly drawn to the books that would attract young people, the stories of the boys. I can remember those stories of Tom Swift. There must have been a dozen or more of those books. All of Edgar Rice Burroughs' stories, the Martian stories, the science fiction. And I think out of that came a rather different view. You may recall when Orson Welles had his famous radio play and a lot of folks got frightened and started leaving home. My concern was I was terribly upset because as I call them, fools were shooting at these people from Mars, and I had been interested in trying to get up there or try to get them down here, and I had hoped that we would communicate with them instead. The knighthood stories, the western stories, the Tarzan stories, books on adventure were my dish. But I was always a slow reader. I couldn't read very fast, but I didn't realize I was a slow reader until I got to college. I discovered it when reading with my girlfriend. We used to study together on occasion, and invariably she'd be through with the page long before I would, and she'd have to wait for me to finish and to move on. And I tried to figure out why I was a slow reader, and I decided at least two reasons were responsible for it. One of them was that I never had any opportunity to learn how to read properly. And secondly, because I enjoyed reading so, I had a long established habit of reading slowly. Any good book that I had, I refused to read more than a certain number of pages daily. in order to make them last. I can recall going for many days reading Les Miserables, and Count of Monte Cristo, Dracula, and some others of that kind. Well, at Shaw Junior High School here in the city, I began to get some idea of what I wanted to do in life. I fell in love with printing. Had a wonderful printing teacher and became so interested in printing that I did a lot of extra things around the shop, and so I was declared the outstanding student in printing. And I remember they called a special assembly so I could be presented with a book by Colonel Wes Hamilton. It's the only book I've never read that I've owned for many years. It was a little book from the government printing office on printing, the dullest book I've ever seen. But nevertheless, I decided that after being the editor of the school newspaper and getting this award, I was going to be a printer. So as a result, I went to Armstrong, whereas most of my friends went to Dunbar. I used to go over to Dunbar quite frequently. We were right across the street at Armstrong Technical School, and I went to Armstrong because that was the only place I could pursue printing. But I visited Dunbar so much that many of my friends thought that I graduated from Dunbar. Now, we had some nice girls at Armstrong, but Dunbar had most of the pretty girls. And I was over there so much that the principal used to chase me away from there regularly. Now, Dunbar, as you know, has its reputation has been heralded around the world, and it was a well-deserved reputation. But I think that Armstrong has never received the recognition it should have had, because here was a school that also had a very real devotion to the life of the mind and a concern for scholastic excellence. We had some very fine teachers at Armstrong. I can think of, for example, Mrs. Bobby Scott, Mrs. Elizabeth Smith, Mrs. Elsie Brown Smith, Mrs. Perkins, Mrs. Isidore Williams Miles, Mr. Cato Adams. They were very devoted teachers, and they did a great deal to stimulate a thirst for learning in the minds of their students. I was very active in scholarship and in extracurricular activities. As a matter of fact, the teachers were so concerned about students not getting too involved in extracurricular activities that they looked at me and made a decision. They found out that I was one of the editors of the yearbook, editor of the newspaper, the deck captain, officer in the officers' club, in each of the plays given. And so they met and made a decision that Robert Martin would not be permitted to take any further part in any other activity because I was spreading myself too thin. Well, I was very much impressed by their concern for my not squandering my potential, and I thanked them for it. Well, Armstrong had put into effect a college preparatory program, and so I entered that and got ready to go to Howard University. Now, I decided, having been poor so long, and I mean, we were really poor, there were many days that my mother and I didn't know where the next meal was coming from. My father was a big red man who had a very low boiling point. He was constantly getting in trouble with his white supervisors because of the way they messed over him. And he'd either slug them or insult them, and he'd have to leave town in either case. So we were constantly moving around. I went to school in Alabama, South Carolina, North Carolina, Florida. As a matter of fact, we traveled so much, my teachers thought I was a preacher's son. The experience of the opportunity to go to the university was one that I wanted to utilize to make some money, and I decided to study business and law. But I came under the influence of a wonderful group of teachers at Howard, people like Ralph Bunch and Sterling Browne and Abram Harris and Alan Locke, E. Franklin Frazier, Emmett Dorsey. And so I got interested in the life of the mind and interested in ideas, and I decided I wanted to be a political science teacher. Well, now, what's the black person going to do teaching political science? Where is he going to get a job? Well, I recognized that there was going to be little opportunity for that. Howard had the only department of political science in the black schools. So I decided then that since I would have to teach one of the other social disciplines, I would go heavily into economics, sociology, history. And as a matter of fact, for the first several years of my teaching life, I taught those courses. It was many years later before I got into political science. I think you'd be amused at how a couple of my friends and I decided what black schools we would apply to. We went over to the library and got a reference book that showed the annual budget of colleges. And we set a figure below which we decided that there's no point in applying there because they couldn't afford us. And on that basis, we made application to these colleges. When I was maturing and deciding on my research and scholastic interests, there was an interesting idea that was current among the academic world. Black teachers seemed to understand that white scholars expected Negroes to write only about Negro subjects. And we wanted to prove that we were qualified, able to write about society in general. My first major effort, Negro Disfranchisement in Virginia, was written essentially from the Negro point of view, the Negro experience. But then for the doctoral dissertation, I decided that I ought to get into a subject that cut across the racial gamut. And so I selected the topic that I'd come across in Ralph Spunt's study in Southern politics on the Agricultural Adjustment Act referenda that presented farmers an opportunity to vote for the first time in any number since Reconstruction. And so I wrote the dissertation on the topic of black-white farmer participation in the AAA cotton and tobacco referenda. The days at Howard were extremely rewarding, particularly for me in terms of the liberal kinds of experiences we had. Students at Howard, we were conducting our strikes against war and fascism. We were presenting plays, the Howard Drama Group under the wonderful direction of Professor Browne and Beanie Butcher. We're presenting social protest plays like They Shall Not Die, based on the Scottsboro Boys, Mighty Window Blowing, based upon sharecropping in the South, Bury the Dead, an anti-war play, Langston Hughes' Weary Blues, very fine commentary upon slavery and sharecropping and sweatshop labor. And we picketed the People's Drug stores and the Safeway stores because they wouldn't hire blacks. Students from Howard went down to Capitol Hill and protested against lynching with ropes around our necks. We had a very fine kind of liberal to radical experience. Dr. Locke and I were put out of O'Donnell's restaurant down on East Street. Very interesting kind of situation. We had heard that some of the restaurants, once they found that the law was likely to be found, the court case which was coming up soon for final solution, was going to open the restaurants and other public places to Negroes in the district. Some of the restaurant owners decided that they would capitulate early and not wait and be forced into it, that they would open to blacks. And so Dr. Locke and I went down for lunch. We were met by the head waiter, who was a Negro student who was in the Howard Law School. He welcomed us, took us to a seat at the table, and then the waiter came over to serve us. He also was a student at Howard and was happy to see us and gave us a menu. Shortly thereafter, the white manager came over and said he was sorry he couldn't serve us. We wondered why. We told him, look, we have money. We don't expect to be fed without paying. He would not say anything other than we cannot serve you. So the waiters, Negro waiters, became very much upset by this and said as the white manager left that they were going to quit. We urged them not to quit, pointing out that we would be back because we knew that that decision was very likely to be in our favor, and so it was. A few months later, we were able to return without any problem there. Frank has mentioned the difficulty of black professionals. I would just want to add one postscript to that. When we were students at Howard, the post office here in Washington, the main post office, was called the boneyard of black professionals. Negro lawyers, some physicians, dentists, scientists were forced to work there because, not because they were not prepared, but only because of discrimination. It has been a very, and I can remember that there were some physicians who worked in the government at low paying but at least regular paydays and practiced only at night. They were often forced to practice only at night after they had made a sure payday at a low paid job in government during the day. They were often called moonlighters. Frank is right. We have indeed come a long way, but has also been said by my friend to the left here, we still have a long way to go. Thank you.
Dr. Martin talks about the moonlighters. When I talk to these people, they talk about sundowners. They went to the offices when the sun went down. The next speaker is Mr. George O. Butler of the Labor Department.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. I was sitting here trying to decide where to begin. And then I looked at the time, and I said maybe I should begin somewhere near the end. To go back and talk about one's early childhood in Washington. And I am a native son, born in what is called Anacostia, far southeast area of Washington. Out of a maternal family that had been heavily into, as participants, slavery, and a paternal family that were free Negroes, both from southern Maryland. One landholders, tobacco farmers, and the others slaves on tobacco farms. My grandmother, who was a maternal grandmother, when I first knew her, was a dominant woman. My maternal grandfather was dead, but he'd been a builder and had built houses all over southeast Washington for the newly freed slaves. So his boys knew carpentry and worked with him. He insisted that education was very important, so he sent his kids to college. It was later that I looked back and saw a very interesting experience for me with a college-trained mother whose forebears had been slaves, and a father who had gone to a 6th grade country school, but whose folks had owned 1,200 acres of tobacco land. It was a very interesting thing from the standpoint of an economist looking back at this. Like Bob Martin, I went to Armstrong High School. But earlier than that, I think the principal influence in looking back came from 2 or 3 key teachers. One in the 5th grade I will always be grateful to, because she turned me around. She also made me see that it was very important to be in charge
of the library book basket. Now, I know most of you don't know what that is. But when I was in the 5th grade, we got a basket of books from the public library in that room every week. Some people got them every 2 weeks. But Miss Browne stimulated reading so much, we could dispose of a basket of books in a week. And I was in charge. That's very important. She not only made me believe that I was part teacher and part librarian, but she also stimulated us to the point that the kinds of books that we read were related to the kinds of things we thought we wanted to be when we grew up. Now, all of you remember, what are you going to be when you grow up? And it's a very intimidating kind of thing for a youngster, because in those days, an adult, I was brought up, you had to give an answer. You were also caught in the middle because they told you couldn't lie. Of course, we knew better than that. But it was very important. Do you give an answer to get people off of you? That's what it really boiled down to. So it gave you a chance to exercise your imagination, how to come up with something that was meaningful, would satisfy the adults, and to keep a straight face so they thought that you were properly deferent to the difference in age. Well, by the time I got to Armstrong High School, the most things that I remember is the fact that they wanted to put me out because I had gotten into a discussion in an English class with Marietta Bonner. Remember her? Somebody raised, we had a discussion, somebody says it's true because it was in the Bible. And I had grown up reading the little blue books by E. Haldeman Julius. I was trying to figure out, as a youngster, what Spinoza was talking about. So I came to the conclusion early, and I said, now remember, I was a 5th generation Roman Catholic from Southern Maryland. So I said, well, that doesn't prove anything. The Bible is Jewish mythology. Well, it would have been almost if somebody had dropped an atomic bomb in that class, and of course I had to go down to G. David Houston's bench and sit on the principal's bench. And they literally talked about throwing me out of school. My section teacher and my physics teacher, J.C. Webster, saved me. He said, Butler, you should learn a lesson from this. If you hadn't made an A in my physics class, I would have let you go. And it was through that, plus scoring pretty high on the first citywide standardized test, that brought me to Bobby Scott's attention. And they looked me up to find out who this fellow was, because I was really not into studying for the intrinsic value of learning. I wanted to read what I wanted to read. And most of the stuff they assigned, I had read much earlier. So I was reading all sorts of exotic things. Then I had a job, run the elevator in I want to call it a hotel because that's what it had out front. It was at 910 East Street and used to house the people at the Gaiety Theater. So I think it was called Hotel Houston. And I worked there every day from 4 o'clock until 12. And my education was improved immensely. Now, when you follow this through, I was ready by the time I got to college. Incidentally, in high school, I prepared for architecture. And I learned about this lying